Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Said with the official preacher voice, used to be the traditional opening for weddings and funeral services. No, not so much now, except on TV and in movies. And as a result, the phrase dearly beloved has all but disappeared from our vocabulary, which is a shame since it is a genuinely marvelous phrase that would serve well as the regular greeting for brothers and sisters in Christ. Wouldn't it be nice to be greeted with, dearly beloved sister, it's so good to see you. Or brother Mike, dearly beloved brother Mike, it's so good to see you. I'm so glad to see you here today. Why can't we say that? It's a shame that we don't. What a difference that might make in our spirit and in our spiritual connection to one another if it were to become our regular way of addressing each other. Even if we drop the dearly and just call each other beloved consistently, is a powerful way for us to become more closely connected to one another, to declare openly the fact that we are loved by one another and that we love each other, because that is something that is to characterize the people of God, especially those who are part of a local church. Now perhaps you're wondering, well, where did that come from? Okay? Especially in light of 3 John, which is all about Diotrephes, right? About this old bad guy out there that just ran people out of the church. Well, tonight's lesson is called Dearly Beloved, and it is from 3 John because it talks about a brother who is dearly beloved to the Apostle John. I think sometimes all we think about is Diotrephes, but when you read the book, it's really about Gaius, or Gaius, depending on how you pronounce it. Same thing with beloved. You either say beloved or beloved. It's just like when we throw the B in front of it, we got to emphasize the second and third syllable. But anyway, John loves this guy named Gaius. Let's read the text, verses 1 through 6, and then we'll skip down to verse 7. It says, the elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Beloved, I pray that in all respects you may prosper and be in good health, just as your soul prospers. For I was very glad when brethren came and testified to your truth. That is how you are walking in truth. I have no greater joy than this, that to hear of my children walking in the truth. Beloved, you are acting faithfully in whatever you accomplish for the brethren, and especially when they are strangers. And they have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. And then you skip down to verse 11. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. The one who does good is of God. The one who does evil has not seen God. So when you read those first 6 verses and then verse 11, you see that 4 times John refers to this man named Gaius as beloved, his beloved brother. And the fact that he emphasizes it so much, it says it these 4 times. First in verse 1, and then in verse 2, and then again in verse 3, and then again in verse 11. 4 times he's declaring how much this guy means to him. And since it is his primary designation for Gaius, it is a strong term of affection. In fact, the word dearly beloved was used by the original, one of the original English versions, but has since been just limited down to beloved by most books. I think the King James Version says much love. It's a strong form of affection for somebody. In fact, in Matthew chapter 3, verse 17, when God speaks from heaven at the baptism of Jesus, he says, this is my beloved Son. And do we not think that he is dearly beloved to God, that the Son would be dearly beloved? So it seemed right to call this our study, 3 John, dearly beloved. And again, that might surprise you, since for the most part, when we think of 3 John, there's always that fly on the plate. You know, when you're eating and there's a fly that lands on the plate, it just won't go away. That's Diotrephes. In fact, raise your hand. All right, we're going to be bold. Get some audience participating. Raise your hand if the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of 3 John is Diotrephes. All right, I see some hands going up. All right, I have to confess, when I was thinking through, preaching through 3 John some weeks ago, you know what my title was going to be? Dealing with Diotrephes. But then as I started working through the text, it came to me very clearly that this isn't about Diotrephes. It's about Gaius and the kind of man that he was. And so hopefully tonight's lesson, and after tonight's lesson, beloved Gaius will be the first thing you think about when you hear the phrase 3 John. And the second thing that will come to mind will be how you can work on becoming comfortable calling your brethren and your brothers and sisters beloved. Using it, speaking it out loud. It's one thing to think it. I think a lot of times we'll think things like that, but then when it comes to say it, we'll say, Sister Faye, instead of beloved Sister Faye. Our tongue just doesn't want to get that word out because it's uncomfortable to us. So let's work on getting comfortable calling each other beloved. Because we are the family of God, and we tell our children how much we love them, I hope. And I know we just pour it all over our grandkids like syrup, practically. And so why can't we do that to each other as well? And I think that's what I'm hoping that's what we'll be able to do after this lesson. Now, obviously, we will have to talk about Diotrephes, and we'll do that. But first, we're going to look at Gaius and the secret brother most of us forget about entirely, Demetrius. All right, raise your hand if you didn't even know there was a guy named Demetrius mentioned in the book. All right, got some hands going up. Okay, there's a third guy in there that we're going to talk about too, because he's a good guy as well. Well, last week we saw in our study that 2 John that the word elder, he just refers to himself as the elder, doesn't call himself by name. In fact, he doesn't do that in any of his books except Revelation. And he says here that calls himself the elder. And that's basically just the idea of someone who is an older person. He would obviously be an older person. It's a generic reference to his age rather than the title elder, authoritative elder like in a local church that we talked about this morning. Think about it. He's probably in his mid-80s. And you're wondering, well, how do you know that? How do you get there? All right, remember, Jesus started his ministry, some say 29, others say 30, I think 29 or 30 AD, and he died 33 AD, and in his early 30s. John, who was one of his first apostles or followers, was probably a young man in his early 20s. He was not an older guy. He was not a mature man, but he was a young man. In fact, most of the disciples are thought to have been, most of those early men that became apostles were thought to be men probably in their 20s. So he would have been young. So about that time, he would have been 20, around 30 AD, say he was 22 or 23 years old. Fast forward 63 years, or 60 years to AD 95, which is when he wrote this letter. That puts him in his 80s, mid to upper 80s. So he would be an elderly man, an older man. That gives you an idea of why he would call himself an elder. All right, so that's who John is. That's who the elder is. But Gaius, who is this Gaius? Gaius is a leader of an unnamed local congregation. He talks about them there. He says in verse 6, they have testified to your love before the church. And so, and it talks about a church here a number of times in the text. And so Gaius is, we don't know if he's an elder or just a leading man who takes a leadership, voluntarily takes a leadership role in the church. And we don't know where the church is. Remember, the book of Revelation addresses 7 churches in Asia, and there are many churches scattered throughout that area that are outside of Ephesus, and John would have been in Ephesus. So it would have been any one of those. We just don't know. Historians never were able to identify that. And the name Gaius is a common name. He's mentioned several times in the book. There's a Gaius in Acts, and there's in some of the other books in the New Testament. But those guys would have been referenced in the early 60s or 50s and 60s, so 30 or 40 years earlier. So probably not one of them, but it doesn't matter. It's a common name like Mike or John or James, something like that people would be called all the time. And it doesn't matter really who he was, except the fact that he is called beloved by John. John loves him dearly. And so as we work our way through this text, what we're going to see is just 2 simple things. Number 1, we're going to see how to be called beloved. What it takes for us to be called beloved like Gaius. And then we got to talk about Diotrephes, so we'll talk about him in the moment at the end, and that is how to be called evil, because that's what Gaius is called. And when you're called good or beloved by an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, that's pretty good. Do you want to have an epitaph? You want to have something said about you? Have what Paul said, John says here about Gaius and about Demetrius. Have that on your tombstone, and have that what people say about you when they think about and talk about you. Well, let's talk about it. How do we come to be called beloved? Well, there are three ways. We can walk in truth, walk faithfully, and walk consistently. Let's go back to the text here in 3 John. In verse 2 he says, Beloved, he's praying for them that he will prosper. In verse 3 he says, For I was very glad when brethren came and testified to your truth. But I don't think he's talking about there and the common concept today of everybody has their own personal truth. The idea is that he's living in truth, and he clarifies that. That is how you are walking in truth. And we've talked about that in previous lessons from 1 John and even some in 2 John, so we won't belabor that. Walking in truth is believing what the gospel teaches about Jesus Christ, and not just the deity of Christ, which was the battle that he was having with the Gnostics of his day, but all the doctrine arising out of Jesus Christ. And walk is the idea of how you live your daily life. It's how you think, how you talk, how you act, how you treat other people. That's walking in truth. When we walk in truth and we live that way on a daily basis, it is known, it is seen, it is recognized, not just by God, but by everybody else around us. And so John, just like he said in 2 John, gets excited when he hears about brethren that are walking in the truth, living by the truth. All right, so that's walking in truth. And that's in verse 3. Then we go to verse 5 to see about walking faithfully. Verse 5, he says this, Beloved, you're acting faithfully in whatever you accomplish for the brethren, and especially when they are strangers. And they have testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their way in a manner worthy of the God of God. For they went out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support such men so that we may be fellow workers with the truth. So what he's saying there is that apparently Gaius was the kind of person that when traveling preachers would show up, and this was a common thing in the first century and in many centuries and even today in some places in the world, where preachers just travel from place to place and they rely on brethren to support them, to provide their support, provide a place to stay, and so that they can survive. These guys are going out preaching the gospel. They are asking and depending on brethren to act faithfully. And the idea is trustworthy, acting trustworthy in demonstrating the way God had demonstrated his faithfulness in the death on the cross Jesus had. And so they would go and teach and preach the word of God, and they would be hoping for brethren. They weren't depending on the world to support them. They were depending on brethren. And it's not a case of deadbeat men sponging off others. I think sometimes we're afraid that that's what that people are going to be like, but that's not what it's talking about here. These were godly men risking and surrendering their lives to do God's work of preaching and teaching. And quite possibly, they had been sent out by John because of their reporting back to him. And Gaius was faithful in supporting them. So when they would show up in town and start to teach, he would invite them to, possibly invite them to his home, but he would make sure that they were provided for, that they had food, they had shelter, they had the things that were necessary for their daily needs of life, and then provide some extra for them so that whenever they would move on to the next town, they would have enough to get there and not have to suffer on the way. That is walking faithfully. Supporting preachers and teachers. That's one of the things that's good about this congregation and so many congregations. It's so much better than it used to be. Churches really supporting brethren and helping them and making sure that they have enough to meet their needs. My dad used to make the joke, and he was an elder for 40-something years. He said, son, when he first found out I was going to be a preacher, he said, son, preaching needs to be poor and humble. The Lord will take care of the humble, and the brethren take care of the poor. Fortunately, over the years, it got better. It got a lot better. The brethren are better about that. And so that's the idea of walking faithfully is caring for others. making sure that they have the necessity. Not that they're rich and living in mansions or driving big fancy cars like the television preachers do. But they have food, clothes, a place to sleep, and they don't have to worry about where the next meal is coming from. Well, that's walking faithfully. The third thing is walk consistently. This is where we get to Demetrius in verse 12. Let's read verse 12 and get an introduction to this guy. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. And we add our testimony. And you know that our testimony is true. So John is vouching for Demetrius. But what about what? What did Demetrius do? You know, if you look at the text, you read this, you have no idea who Demetrius is, what Demetrius is doing. But what you do find out is that John speaks highly of him, which means he's a faithful brother, and then so does everyone else. And that's where we get the consistency, or the idea of walking consistently. This man, Demetrius, whatever it is that he does in front of everybody. He doesn't put on a show for this person and do a different show for that other person. He doesn't act differently in whatever situation he's in. He presents a believer, a follower of God, everywhere he goes. And so as a result, everyone speaks well of him. Now this is what I was talking about, thinking about. Can you imagine if that is the epitaph on your tomb? Everybody speaks well of him. That's hard to do. Because a lot of people, some people just not going to like you no matter what. But if everybody is speaking well, it says much about him, that he is very consistent and consistent in a good way. So really, when you read through 3 John, that's what it's about. How to walk and the importance of walking in truth, walking faithfully and serving others, and then walking consistently. And so when you think of 3 John, think of beloved Gaius and walking the right way before God. But can't talk about 3 John without talking about Diotrephes. And that is when we get the thing for this idea of how to be called evil. What do we have to do to be someone who's called evil? Well, let's read verses 9 through 11. Verse 9, he says, I wrote something to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first among them, does not accept what we say. For this reason, if I come, I will call attention to his deeds, which he does, unjustly accusing us with wicked words. And not satisfied with this, he himself does not receive the brethren either. And he forbids those who desire to do so, and puts them out of the church. This is the passage I was referring to this morning about excluding people that belong. Verse 11, beloved, speaking to Gaius, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. The one who does good is of God. The one who does evil has not seen God. So he doesn't specifically say that Diotrephes is an evil man, but he describes what Diotrephes does, declares the fact that he's going to call him out on it, and then tells Gaius, don't be like that. Don't be evil like that. Don't follow after evil. Don't imitate or mimic what is evil, but rather what is good. And so he calls him evil. And there are a couple of ways he's defined here as being evil. You want to talk about how to be evil? Here are 2 ways. One is desire to be first. Desire for preeminence. Because that is a huge, huge flaw in the kingdom. But it pops up all frequently as people just want to be in charge. They want to be the one who's over everybody else because they think they know better or they're smarter or whatever it is, that they just deserve to be ahead of everybody. And God says, that's evil. Desire for preeminence is evil. Do you remember how Jesus rebuked James and John for wanting preeminence? Keep your marker for 3 John. Turn back over to Mark, the 10th chapter. Mark chapter 10. We read of the event there where Jesus is being asked by James and John, and another account says that their mother asked for them. They're asking for places of preeminence. And this is Mark chapter 10 and verse 35. James and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you. Wow, they probably could have quoted what was Timothy, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can do all things if you'll do this for me, Lord. We want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. Well, they're going to ask something that's foolish. And he said to them, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant that we may sit, one on your right and one on your left, in your glory. So what they're asking for is that when you establish your kingdom, we want to be your right and left hand men. We want to be the guys that are right up there on the stage with you. You've got your throne, and we're going to be sitting or standing right next to you. And everybody's going to know we're the guys to come to. If you want access to Jesus, you got to go through us. Preeminence. They were desiring preeminence. Verse 38, Jesus said to them, you do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism which I am baptized? Talking about his death, he said, are you willing to die for me? Well, James is the first apostle who died, by the way, and so they do. Verse 39, they said to him, we are able. And Jesus said to them, the cup that I drink, you shall drink. And you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. It's interesting that John is the oldest of the apostles, and James was the first to die. Verse 40 says, but to sit on my right or on my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared. So you're not ready for this. And the reason they're not ready for it is because they want it. I was joking with someone earlier today about whether being an elder or wanting to be an elder. And the desiring the office. Desiring to do the work, I think is what it's talking about there. But if you're desiring the office, then you're disqualified because it's about you. If you're desiring to do the work, then that's different. And usually that's a good sign of someone that's qualified. They're not pursuing it. It's not important to them. The work is important. But anyway, they were desiring the office. And then in verse 41, the other disciples get in on this. They were like, wait a minute. Verse 41, hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. And they're mad because they want the same places. Verse 42, calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. The preeminent ones, make sure everybody knows they're preeminent. And their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. Diotrephes was exactly the opposite of that. Diotrephes was like the Lord of the Gentiles who wanted to make sure that everybody else died in front of him, everybody else suffered before he did, because he was in charge. It was not about serving, it was not about giving himself for the work and for the people, it was about them doing their best to make sure everything is great for him because he's the greatest. That was his desire for preeminence, to be first among them. So that's the first thing that will make you an evil person. Wanting to be first in front of everybody. The second thing here is not listening to the apostles. Second part of verse 9, does not accept what we say. So he's not going to listen to John. And there's an interesting progression in the letter, not really in these three letters. And I didn't see this until I was working on this lesson. But there's an interesting progression here. Beginning at 1 John, go back to 1 John chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 6 in 1 John, he says this, Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. Because many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know that the Spirit of God, every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that is coming and now is already in the world. You are from God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. And then notice verses 5 and 6. They are from the world, therefore they speak as from the world, and the world listens to them. So they got a voice that they listen to. But we are from God. He who knows God, so anyone who is connected to God, listens to us, the apostles there specifically, and in particular John. He who is not from God does not listen to this, By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. And the spirit is a small in that case. It's just the attitude or the mindset of truth and the mindset of error. Truth listens to the apostle and does what the apostle says. Now, turn over a couple of pages to 2 John. And in 2 John, and in verses 9 and 11, verses 9 to 11, we see this. Anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. The one who abides in the teaching, he has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring his teaching, do not receive him into your house and do not give him a greeting. So in 1 John, he's saying if they don't hold the truth, they are not of God. Then here in 2 John, he says if somebody comes to you who's not holding to the truth, they're not of God, and don't have anything to do with him. Do not receive him into your house. Do not give him a greeting, for the one who gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds. So you don't want to have anything to do with them. You don't give them a place in your life, and more specifically in the church's life. And then here in 3 John, he says it's someone who does not accept what he says, and this person is the person who kicks people out. John, in 2 John, and 1 John says test the spirit. 2 John he says don't let them in. And in 3 John he condemns the man who kicks out truth believers and truth teachers. 3 John that is. Okay, verse 10. For this reason, if I come, I will call attention to his deeds which he doesn't. He's going to call him out. He's going to identify him and rebuke him before all. Because this is what he does, unjustly accusing us. So he attacks the apostles with wicked words. And that's not enough. He doesn't receive the brethren either. So he excludes godly brethren. And then there are people within the church who would receive them. He'll kick them out as well. That's what preeminent people do. They kick out anybody that challenges their position of authority. Those who have not God are to be identified and excluded from the local church. And even the elders. I mentioned this morning that I was going to talk about this. Even elders. Elders who exercise authority beyond Scripture need to be called out, and if they will not back down, driven out of the church. You want to talk about a mess? That's a mess. Typically what happens, the church is split because of that. Because they're not going to relinquish their authority because they've got preeminence and they're not going to let go of it. And it's happening, and I'm telling you, that's what's going to be happening in churches all across this country. As more and more elders are becoming determined to have their will and their way and exercise preeminence over the local churches. But there are a lot of faithful churches and a lot of godly elders. I know some in Palm Springs that are godly men who are not like this. And in other churches that are not like this. But anyway, that's doctrines. I don't want to spend all our time talking about doctrines. So let's just wrap up with some takeaways. First thing is honor those who lead faithfully. Honor them. Respect them. And if they're the elders of the congregation where you're a member, submit to them to the degree that they submit to the will of God. So honor those who lead faithfully. Then honor those who live consistently. You know people that are faithful and they demonstrate it everywhere they go. Honor that. Call them. You know, beloved, I am so glad to see you because every time I hear about you or I see you, I think about how faithful you are in serving Christ. Get used to saying that kind of stuff to people. Get used to hearing it from brethren. Call me to the carpet when I don't do it for you because you deserve to be treated like that because you do live consistently. And then finally, just call out those who don't, especially leaders. Because respect by leaders is earned daily, and it cannot be seized or demanded. I know of elders who have said, we're the elders, you just have to do what we say. Once an elder says that, I'm just telling you this flat out. Once an elder has to tell you, I'm the elder, you have to do what I say, they've lost their position of authority over you. Because now they're acting like a ruler instead of a leader. They have to earn that position. They have to earn that right. We'll go ahead and get songbooks out. We're going to have to wrap up with one final question, one thought question. That's this. Are you one of God's that you? Does that describe you? I hope so. I think it does. I'm looking out here at everyone here tonight. I think that is an apt description of each one of you. That you are beloved. Beloved to me, beloved to each other, because you're beloved to God. I'm glad to know that. So perhaps there's someone here, though, that needs encouragement. Just needs maybe a hug or words of encouragement to say, you know what, maybe you're struggling, we can help you because you're loved. We can help you be one of God's beloved. Please come while we stand.